Douglas, Ansua said she's concerned about Britain pouring money into countries like Kenya. Do you know where this money is going?
Yes, we do. I travelled to Kenya in late November and saw for myself the kind of work that we are spending money on. Clearly at the moment this is a very troubled time for Kenya and all of us feel revulsion and horror at the images of violence and brutality that we've seen on our screens over the last month. That's why we're reviewing our aid programme at the moment. But I want to make very clear that the money that is being spent is going to assist many of the most vulnerable and the poorest within Kenyan society. I had the opportunity to visit a community where we were literally handing out malarial treated bed nets, which is vital to stop the spread of malaria. We actually make sure that the figures are published literally on the school door so that parents themselves know what money is due to have been spent in that community and can then judge in terms of the number of teachers and the number of classrooms that the word has been kept in terms of money being spent. So it's about £50 million that we spend every year in Kenya. It goes directly to those sectors, social sectors, health and education, where I think we can make the biggest difference. Kenya is not a particularly aid-dependent country. In fact, if you look at the money generated, for example, by tourism, it's much, much larger. And that's why I think it's very important that my department works closely with David's, and indeed we work as part of a broader international effort to support the work that Kofi Annan is taking forward at the moment to try and find the basis for national reconciliation and to find a way forward after the desperate difficulties of the last few weeks.
Another question for both of you now. What can you do to ensure that British business behave responsibly in the developing world?
I think that I pick out two or three things, really. First of all, to emphasise that the rules-based institutions that exist around the world, whether they be the World Trade Organization or other systems, ensure that there are clear rules for businesses from developing countries as well as for investors in developing countries, and I think that international agreements of that kind are important. Secondly, I think it's important that we're clear about some basic principles. For example, our support for the International Labour Organization makes the really important point that trade unions are a vital part of any civilized society, and they're there to help try to check the sort of abuse that can take place. Thirdly, and I think this is maybe a thing for British business, if you talked about corporate social responsibility a decade ago, people would have seen it as a pretty marginal thing. Maybe at best you'd see a company giving 1% of its business profits over to charity or something like that. I think what's happened in the last 10 years is that British government, but also critically British consumers, have had their voice heard. And British business knows that if it's exposed as employing child labour or otherwise failing to fulfil its corporate social responsibility requirements, then it will suffer at the cash till. Now, one shouldn't be too dewy-eyed about this. One's got to be clear about the need for international rules as well, and for domestic, decent political conditions, which is obviously something that we work on from the Foreign Office. But I think there's a role for the British consumer here, and I think it's a voice that's being heard by British business.
I'd broadly echo those sentiments. When I was in Tanzania recently, met with President Kikwete, who told me from his experience that the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, one of those guidelines set internationally, had made a real difference in terms of the work he was doing to try and secure some revenue for the people of Tanzania from the extractive industries that are presently working in Tanzania. The EITI was a British initiative, we continue to support it. And he was really just acknowledging the fact that it was making a real difference in terms of him being able to make those choices on behalf of the Tanzanian people. So I think there is a role for the OECD guidelines for multinational companies, there's a role for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, but I think David's point about the role of consumers should not be underplayed either. Just to pick up his point about the change in corporate social responsibility, I think it is a cause but not yet a culture in enough businesses. But I think the really exciting change over the decade has been, if we'd been having the conversation with business about their responsibilities in the developing world, it would basically have been about how companies can give money away. And actually, corporate social responsibility is now allowing a much broader conversation about how companies actually make their money. And in that sense, I do think there's a big role for responsible businesses helping to generate the profits and the wealth, which in turn can be shared amongst the people of developing countries. And that really lies behind one of Gordon Brown's recent initiatives, which is to say, is there more that the private sector can do to help us as a global community meet the Millennium Development Goals? And in 2 or 3 months' time we will be hosting a meeting in London saying how can the private sector contribute to the Millennium Development Goals. It's rather akin to the work that David did when he was at the Environment Ministry in recognising that the challenge of climate change can't simply be addressed by government or business or by individuals working alone. There's enough work for all of us. I think that's true for global poverty reduction as well. There's a role for responsible private sector players, there's definitely a role for governments, and there's also a role for concerned consumers and citizens too.
Douglas, Laura asked, do you agree that the current world trade law is controlled by rigged rules and double standards? For example, what are you doing to prevent dumping of excess US products into developing markets?
Let's start with the general and then we'll go to the specific. As a British government, we're determined to try and secure the promise that was made back in Doha in 2001, and that was that we should have a trade round which actually recognises the particular needs of developing countries. That does require action on our agricultural subsidies, the domestic subsidies that are paid within, whether it's the United States or the European Union. It also requires real action on export subsidies, the premium that's paid to farmers here in Europe and across the United States to export their goods and often dump them in the developing world. And thirdly, it does mean we need to have far more generous rules in terms of facilitating the ability of producers and manufacturers in the South to be able to sell their goods into the European Union and into the United States without facing the kind of tariffs that they've faced. But there's quite an important philosophical point here as well, which is what is the best route to secure a more fair trading environment? And both instinctively and on the basis of the evidence, I believe a multilateral approach is the right approach to take. Give me one example. Take Cancun, where there was great disappointment that there wasn't more progress made on the trade rules. The effect after Cancun was to lead to a whole number of countries signing bilateral agreements, often between the United States and very poor developing countries. Now, if you just think for a moment as to the relative negotiating strength of the United States on one side of the table and a developing country on the other, I think that makes an eloquent case for continuing to work through the World Trade Organization, whereby everybody's voice can be heard and we can find the multilateral rules-based system which offers a better future for countries. I therefore think we do need to continue to work in what will be critical weeks and months ahead to support the WTO to find a way forward on the Doha round. I think it does mean, as our department does, we need to continue to work hard to provide financial and technical support to countries to be able to participate on an equal footing within the World Trade Organization. And then we need to make sure that if there needs to be the involvement of heads of state, this is an issue that Gordon Brown, our Prime Minister, is very committed on, we play those in as well, because I do think if you look back to how do we deal with many of the biggest challenges we face in development, aid flows has a role to play, the cancellation of debt, where again the British government has led the way, has a key role to play. But the third and most vital component of that is not just aid flows and debt reduction, but also that we allow people to be able to trade their way out of poverty. There literally isn't a country in the world where it's been able to lift itself out of poverty but by trade in recent decades. That's why we should continue to hold to the case that's been made to say let's find a way forward which is multilateral in character and which gives everybody a fair chance.
Douglas, Edward's question is how can we ensure that children in some of the most poverty-stricken areas in the world can have the hope that they can get out of such conditions and make a positive contribution to their countries and the world?
I think it's an incredibly important question. I mean, in the work that I now do on behalf of party members and the whole country, little affects you as much as some of the children that you meet. I mean, these children who I met in Bangladesh immediately before Christmas, often who had lost one or both parents in the cyclone, were being cared for by Save the Children, a fabulous children's centre that had been established in the coastal villages. And what strikes you is the extraordinary sense of possibility that these children retain, despite the most terrible living conditions and personal tragedy that has afflicted them. And in that sense, I think it makes the case for us holding fast to the commitments that we've made as a government. We're the first government in British history to say that we are going to meet the UN gold standard of 0.7% of our GNI, our economic statistics, 0.7% being made by a particular date. We're going to do that by 2013. Nobody's done that before. The difference that that makes is literally millions and millions more pounds available for the kind of programmes that we are spending money on. It means that we're able to provide support to British organisations like Save the Children dealing with humanitarian disasters like the cyclone. But it also means that we are putting in place the tools and the building blocks to help those children succeed. It means we are paying for teachers. Take Afghanistan, much in the news at the moment. It's British money that's helped raise the number of kids in school in Afghanistan from 900,000 boys under the Taliban to 5.4 million children today in Afghanistan, more than 2 million of them young girls. It means that it's British money that's paying for these children to have inoculations, to have bed nets to protect them from mosquito-borne malaria. So whether it's in health, whether it's in education, or whether it's in helping create the circumstances in which their parents can lift themselves out of poverty by having a job, I just can't tell you how proud I am of the work that British people and British money is doing in developing countries at the moment. That wouldn't have been possible but for people of conscience in the Labour Party and elsewhere choosing to make that a national priority. And in that sense, if you had the chance that I had to meet these children, I don't think you need to be convinced by statistics. Their stories alone convince you that we are making a difference and we need to carry on making a difference.